a challenge to dignity. Our goal was to link academics, activists, and agencies concerned with the health of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of collaboration and comparison, bringing together professionals working with different populations of forcibly displaced peoples, ethnic groups, and nations. The video you are watching will contain an individual presentation edited to stand alone. We hope you find them to be of value. Our next paper is jointly authored by Odgers, who is a sociologist whose principal research interests are in the crossroads of migration, religion, and health, focusing on the experience of migrants trapped in mobility on the US-Mexico border. She is a professor at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana, and Olga Olivas Hernandez, who is an anthropologist with research expertise on new spiritualities, mental health, and migration, as well as substance abuse and healing systems. She is also in the social studies department at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, and she is also a lecturer in the global health program here at UC San Diego. The title of the talk is The Use of Waiting as a Deterrent to Migration and Its Effect on the Well-Being of Asylum Seekers. Olga?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this introduction and for organizing this amazing event. I start saying that this is part of a larger project that we are working on collaboration with our colleagues at UCSD as well. And I will read to not be lost on time. So the US-Mexico border has traditionally been a transit migration zone, but significant changes have occurred in the last 5 years. The diversification of the places of origin, a more substantial presence of women, minors, and accompanied minors. Likewise, the reinforcement of border control has led to a diversification of crossing strategies, adding to the flows of undocumented crossing, asylum seeking, or protection under the temporary protected status. In addition, and this is important but not very visible, there has been an increase in the number of waiting places and times. The pandemic has been a critical alibi to increase even more the stranding times. The conditions of strandedness is produced by, among other causes, the tightening of border controls, frequent changes in the laws and procedures governing asylum requests, and growing efforts by the Mexican government to take it harder for potential asylum seekers to travel through Mexico, in concert with a growing global tendency toward externalization of borders. Thus, migration strandedness is now a central aspect of the mechanisms for controlling migration in transit, both in the Americas and other contexts. For this reason, we considered it necessary to understand the implications of the lengthening of strandedness from the migrants' experience. This study is part of an ethnographic research project, Itinerarios sobre Salud y Migración, undertaken in 2019 in Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico. We primarily conducted field work in one shelter for migrant families, which also functions as a cultural center. Its residents include children, youth, adults, and to a lesser degree, the elderly. They have a capacity for 25 persons approximately and provide different services to the migrant community living in and out of the shelter. We have followed up on their situations at the border for periods that range from weeks to 2 years. We conducted an ethnographic observation at the shelter while developing a knitting workshop, attending cultural events, and teaching Spanish lessons. Based on our contact with the migrant community living in the shelter or receiving its services, we conducted 47 in-depth interviews in Spanish, English, and French. The participants in this study were primarily from Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa. Most of the participants were stranded in the border region either because they were waiting to start an asylum petition in the United States or were under the MPP. The rest were redefining their migration project, beginning a refuge petition in Mexico, finding possibilities to get temporary or permanent residency, looking from family reunification in Mexico, or waiting to cross the border undocumented. The condition of the migration project was not static in some cases, and individuals or families could move from an stranded condition to a redefinition of the project or vice versa. From a structural or systemic perspective, we can consider that the condition of strandedness is produced by the combined effect of different national states' migration policies, which configure what Michael Lagier calls transnational management of undesirables. In essence, undesirable populations are pressured to leave certain territories and arrive to other countries where effective mechanisms to implement their reception are inexistent. It produces spaces of strandedness which become visible with the appearance of refugee camps or overcrowded detention centers for immigrants. We argue that the increase in waiting times is not an unintended effect of the current migration policies. It is a control and deterrence strategy over migration. Therefore, migrants are stranded within their mobility rather than in waiting, which means that official and extra-official devices force them to remain for uncertain and extended periods in places they did not choose. There are some hotspots for migration strandedness in Mexico, which include its northern and southern borders. Both places of strandedness are part of what Campos called the Mexican transit control regime. We consider that understanding the devices that produce strandedness is essential, but it's not enough. In addition to analyzing the structural dimension that immobilizes population within their migration trajectories, it is necessary to add a phenomenological analysis that understands the experience of strandedness from asylum seekers and migrants' perspective. From our perspective, the condition of strandedness relates to the migration project. People are stranded when they cannot move forward to their destination places, neither backward to their home countries. Elsewhere, we propose that it is possible to identify at least 4 different types of strandedness based on the identification of the migration projects. Truncated projects, deportees that cannot return to the host countries, neither have another place to go. In waiting projects, asylum seekers in Mexico or the United States under the MPP, or migrants that are unable to start an asylum petition due to border closures and restrictions. Shifting projects in the face of the impossibility to continue the migration project. An alternative project is shaped during migration grief. Parallel projects, new migratory projects emerge under strandedness, and the former project also remains. Economic and emotional resources are invested to reach both, even knowing that they are exclusive. We would like also to talk about how strandedness occurs. In the specific case of the Mexican transit control regime, the most evident migration strandedness device is this in the south is operated by the Mexican Commission for Refugee Aid, forcing then tens of thousands of refugee claimants to face an uncertain wait in precarious conditions. On the northern border, where we mainly conducted this study, the main strandedness devices are those related to deportation, return, and removal, Title 42, as well as the provisions that affect those who attempt to apply for asylum in the US and must remain in Mexico before doing so. Some of the recent instruments that have lengthening waiting times are the closing of the border under the health contingency and the MPP. Others, less obvious, are related to the difficulty accessing the information on new legislation and the mechanisms to request asylum, or the obligation to have a lawyer given the lack of resources and the fact that civil society organization lawyers working pro bono are overstretched. Some implications of strandedness we argue that strandedness means that people stranded within their mobility must remain for extended periods in stranding societies, not host societies. And these societies lack integration strategies and consider them persons in transit. Additionally, migrants struggle to concentrate their efforts and resources on the integration. But more profoundly, strandedness produces a tension between putting life on waiting for months or years and life that continues flowing or drawing on despite everything. Thus, for example, children stop going to school but continue growing. Migrants and asylum seekers remain in shelters or precarious houses because they are temporary, but time moves on for months or years without a worthy place to live. A chronic health problem has not been cared for because they have not arrived at the destination place to receive quality health care, hopefully. Nevertheless, the health problem continues to get worse. These tensions affect migrants' well-being who from precariousness must develop strategies to cope with it. Matthews and Izquierdo propose that well-being is an optimal state of an individual, community, society, and the world as a whole. It is conceived of, expressed, and experienced in different ways by different individuals and within the cultural context of different societies. We're interested in approaching a perspective that addresses the individual, community, and social dimensions of well-being experiences in particular contexts and temporalities. To this end, it is necessary to understand the circumstances faced by migrants in places of strandedness and the meaning that time acquires in the course of these experiences, especially considering the uncertainty and indeterminacy they go through during the administrative procedures related to their migration processes. To approach the relationship between places of strandedness and well-being experiences, we considered it relevant to understand the social meaning that these places have, not only as a context in which well-being as an outcome emerges, but as places that are inherently relational in both its production and its influence. Places understood as relational requires attention to the processes that help to build a sense of community, social cohesion, and trust, and hence livability and so forth, an approach that has come to be labeled as placemaking and place shaping. The processes of placemaking and shaping have implications for well-being and can be identified through the opportunities and constraints migrants and asylum seekers experience while pursuing integration in places of strandedness. The following are some of the conditions experienced during strandedness that impact migrants and asylum seekers' well-being. First, mobility has implied the abandonment of life projects anchored in the place of origin. Although preserving one's life becomes a priority during mobility, people who migrate hope to achieve stability in the present and be extended into the future. However, the uncertainty of strandedness prevents stability from being accomplished. There are various losses, material and social, associated with the departure from the place of origin. Still, there is difficulty accessing resources, material, social, and political during the migration experience, allowing them to visualize viable life projects for the future. Under these circumstances, these populations may face a constant redefinition of their migration and life projects to find stability in the present from where they can project themselves into the future. We will share short vignettes from the story of some of our collaborators in this study. Together with her parents and sister, Karen fled violence in El Salvador. During her migration trajectory, she went through various emotional experiences and a suicide attempt. Derived both from the precariousness in which she found herself in Mexico and the abandonment of a life project that excited her and gave meaning to her life in her place of origin. The family redefined their migration project several times, started their refugee application in Mexico, and later abandoned it after experiencing violence in the country. Subsequently, they began applying for asylum in the US under the MPP. This implied making their living conditions precarious in an extended and indefinite manner to focus on a petition they were not sure they would obtain. Faced with the emotional and material exhaustion generated, they gave up the application and resumed the refuge petition in Mexico again. They considered that it was a way that would allow them to get out of the strandedness condition, to rebuild their life projects with greater certainty in Mexico. In addition to the labor and educational opportunities they found at the Mexican border to develop feasible life projects. After being a victim of torture and extreme violence, Joy fled Cameroon, leaving behind her 4 children. Arriving at Mexico's southern border, she obtained, without applying for it, permanent residency as a stateless person. She now lives in Tijuana and faces a dilemma. Either she must turn to her legal status in Mexico to start the family reunification process and see her children relatively soon, even though she knows that Tijuana is not a safe place for them, or she must start the asylum process in the US, knowing that it will be a long time before she sees her children again. Faced with the dilemma, she builds parallel projects, which require investing financial and emotional resources that keep her exhausted for an indeterminate period. Often, migrants face various challenges specific to the border region and their migratory status. Some continue to face multiple concerns due to the conditions their families are living in their places of origin, or need to care for family members traveling with them. In both circumstances, migrants encounter limitations in caring for family needs, which detriment their well-being. These experiences shed light on the communitarian and relational sense of well-being. Marcos flees El Salvador with his wife, 2 daughters, and mother after receiving death threats. Since leaving his place of origin, he assumes responsibility for taking care of his family's needs. For him, the asylum process under the MPP implied the confrontation of several unforeseen conditions, such as seeking help for his mother's health problems, his daughter's education, having access to a safe place to live, and providing emotional support for his family in the face of a long and uncertain process. Even though Mario is going through emotional difficulties, he tries to encourage his family, hiding his vulnerability to the situation. To confront his emotional condition, he resorts to religious practices, both to ask God's intercession on obtaining asylum and to maintain hope, as well as to recognize from his relationship with the sacred the emotional difficulties he's going through. After being subjected to violence by an extremist group, Seydou had to flee Burkina Faso, leaving his mother, his pregnant wife, and his son under the protection of his uncle. After a long and challenging journey, he reached Mexico, where he was granted refugee status and found a job to provide for his basic needs. A few months after living in Tijuana, his uncle was killed in a massacre in his place of origin. His family became helpless. So Seydou went to the Mexican Commission for Refugee Aid to request the refugee status for his family and get them out of Burkina as a matter of urgency. However, this commission, what she got was only confusing information and the warning. It is a procedure that takes between 7 months and a year. Seydou thought about the situation of danger and extreme defenselessness of his family and answered, I don't know if in 7 months I will still have a family to bring. He's currently experiencing a severe depressive crisis. The condition of strandedness increases the needs they must meet. Therefore, the limitations they face to achieve social, cultural, and economic integration in the places of strandedness have implications for their well-being. In some cases, they experience the need to develop parallel migration projects, which implies the investment of significant financial and emotional resources with no certainty as to which, if any, of these projects will become real. Although he is only 18 years old, Aziz has already made the undocumented journey from Ghana, his birthplace, to this border twice. The first time he was deported while still a minor. Now, while he waits for the opportunity to apply for asylum, he works in the parking lot of a supermarket in Tijuana, where he spends his time making plans while working. One day, he dreams of bringing a wife from Ghana that his family would choose for him. Another day, he thinks about revalidating his school diplomas to continue studying in Tijuana and attend university in the future. But he also plans to enlist in the Mexican army to secure a livelihood. And at the same time, he longs for all these dreams, for which he invests energy and emotions. They could be suspended if he's authorized to cross the border to seek asylum in the US. Carvel strives to learn Spanish, obtain decent housing, and improve his job to receive his family in better conditions. He went through the lengthy and costly reunification family process under the National Immigration Institute as an stateless person. At the same time, Carvel invested time and money to apply for asylum in the US. Finally, the timing works out, and he manages to combine both projects. Once his family arrives in Tijuana, he gets the support of a sponsor to cross the border, so they all cross together. Then they begin a new and long waiting process in the US with the illusion of being granted asylum.
2 minutes over.
As a conclusion remarks, we would like to share some ideas. For people who have fled violence, a central aspect of well-being is inhabiting spaces where they can safeguard their lives. However, preserving life in conditions of strandedness continue to undermine well-being. Addressing strandedness, spatial and temporal conditions, allow us to identify asylum seekers' needs to experience well-being. Spatial conditions are not limited to the material resources available, but to the subjective meanings that the space acquires for migrants' populations as places from which it is possible to sustain a life project aligned with their well-being perspective. The indeterminacy of strandedness, temporality, exacerbates the uncertainty of concluding the migration project, undermining well-being. We identify three aspects relevant for migrants' well-being while being stranded: to maintain or redefine migration projects that will allow them to build affordable and desirable life projects, to keep or recover the family unit and integrity, and to gain access to social, cultural, and economic resources in the context of the strandedness, allowing them to experience integration amidst indeterminate uncertainty. Well-being for asylum seekers in conditions of strandedness is not limited to meeting their basic needs in the present. However, to the possibilities they have in the world to develop dignified life projects in contexts where they could be attainable. While the tension between putting the life in waiting and the life that continues drawing on is not solved, the conditions for a dignified life project are not granted. Thank you for listening.
All the questions?
Okay, it's really exciting work, Olga. So I guess I would be interested in your thoughts on what Derek Sila presented earlier about detention centers and the harms of conditions there compared again to this, forever waiting and never being able to integrate and put in your resources for the survival in such a dangerous situation on the border when migrants get stuck there. So, how do you think about these two options and what are the implications?
Well, we have shown with these stories as well, and this is something that we continue to explore with the people there, that of course there is all these hard situations they are dealing with, but also the way they manage, they find ways to cope with it amidst this very hard situation. So when we talk about strandedness, it's just to highlight that they are sometimes waiting, but they don't know what they are waiting for. So they are like having different directions they could go, but they don't have the certainty that these directions are really viable for them. So it's a condition where they are struggling every day, trying to cope with that and finding ways to endure these situations. So I think that that's something, these tensions are present always in their daily life, and it has to do with these different situations they are dealing with and low possibilities of dealing with them and the constrictions. So it's a very dynamic situation that, as we said, like it undermines well-being in that sense. They can have stability at some point, but then again, instability. So it's a very fluent situation.
Can I say something? I just want to say that I totally understand what you're saying. I'm counseling someone from Jordan. Actually, he's Palestinian, and his family are stuck in Jordan, and he's here by himself. He has 4 kids, 3 girls, 1 boy, and his wife. So he's very worried about them. He did seek asylum, and then he doesn't know what's going to happen, exactly what you're saying. And he's, I totally fear everything that you're saying because I'm counseling him and he's having a really hard time. He's depressed. He wants his family. He's worried about them. And he's like, his wife works, but it's not even that. It's an emotional, psychological being away from the family, missing on his children growing up. He doesn't know his children. What's camera and phone? That's nothing, right? Like he talks to them with a camera and a phone. So I totally understand everything that you're saying. And it's very difficult for him. I try to support him. I'm his psychologist, but it's devastating. I totally understand what you're saying because I see how he is, and like you said, there's no hope. There's no way out, just no hope. He doesn't know what to do. And if he goes back, he's going to go to jail because of, the Palestinian Authority working with Israel and all this stuff. So he's going to go to jail just because he's fighting for his country and all this stuff. The political situation over there. So he cannot go back because he'll go to jail and he cannot leave his family, like young kids and a wife. That's probably a similar situation to what you're talking about. So thank you. It's a very important point that you're touching on.
Thank you for this comment.
Thank you very much for that. I was really struck by the young person who has so many different options: marriage with somebody who gets chosen for him, learning Spanish and going to school and university, crossing the border to see his father. So that these like three totally different kind of strategies all going on at the same time in his mind. But I haven't thought about this for a long time, but I remember when I was interviewing Afghan families about mental health, especially the young adolescents, they were saying to me, and I think it's interesting because the next presentation is on trauma, that mental health is not determined by the past, but by the future. Because it's the narrative and the meaning making and the articulation of coherence between the past, the present, and the future. And so if the future has no coherence, you have very poor mental health. Mm-hmm. So I think you just reminded me of that. Thank you. In the sense that, it's not so much, we're very often thinking about the past and the present as a determinant of health, but we very rarely think about the future as a determinant for mental health.
Yeah, thank you. This is an interesting comment because we found that they are carrying all the issues they lived in their home countries as well. But at the same time, they left with a hope to find a better place, to find a stability, to start again their life projects. And yes, when this future is not very clear, is uncertain, and it's probably not feasible from their own desires or what they want in their life, this is what it becomes like for them, very shocking and detriments their conditions, of course.
I just want to add to what you're saying. There's no hope that they will get an asylum. It's just maybe. So they know it's maybe. It's not for sure they will live in the U.S., correct?
Yes, and that's why some of them try to find other strategies, like crossing undocumented and not requesting asylum. They are just going to or change the project and stay in Mexico, even if they are dealing with other precarities, but at least they have for sure something. So it's very clear how they are like handling and trying to struggle with that.
I think that it's very interesting that there's a time and a space dimension to this. The idea of being stranded in space and suspended in time. Mm-hmm. Yet it doesn't mean that they're frozen. Mm-hmm. And this is why I really like the idea of project, the way you're thinking of things in terms of having a project. Because and that they have multiple, that they're thinking constantly and improvising, right? Mm-hmm. Improvising and strategizing. So in that way, having a project goes around or sidesteps the idea even of agency, and it sidesteps even the idea of hope. Because you can have a project with very little hope, right? But you're still trying to figure things out. So I do very much like this idea of thinking in terms of projects, even beyond the idea of agency or hope.
Yeah. And how the migration project is quietly intertwined with the life project as well. So it's like seeing these dimensions of their experience that are overlapped as well. Thank you for this comment.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you know? I know a family in Mexico, and they're trying to get in the U.S. and seeking asylum. That's possible. They come in the border, or they won't let them in the border. I don't know how that goes. Do you know?
Yes, well, it has changed a lot over the time. A
Uh-huh.
lot of people was rejected, and before it seems that in the Tijuana San Isidro border there was no way to request asylum, but then the process have changed in 2016 and 2017. There was a big amount of people requesting asylum, so the Mexican National Immigration Institute, they started like with a notebook with a waiting list
Uh-huh.
just to start a petition. So they were not starting the petition yet,
Oh.
but there was a list and they were called by numbers. Then that changed, and now the procedure is quite different. They should do this through an organization and ask for a parole, and it has changed a lot.
It's a Mexican organization, and they ask for parole. You're saying?
Yes, and a civil society organization based there.
Oh, wow, okay.
So it has changing a lot.
Yes. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Olga.